Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and a warm welcome wherever you are to our MSCA Postdoctoral Fellowship webinar. My name is Jane Carrigan, and I'm one of two national contact points for the MSCA in Ireland. The Irish Marie Skłodowska-Curie Office is supported by the Irish Research Council and operated under a joint partnership with the Irish Universities Association. Our mission is to support the research community in Ireland across all disciplines and sectors in both applying for MSCA funding and in implementing MSCA projects. We do this in a number of ways, including promoting MSCA programs through workshops, information sessions, and of course, webinars like this one. We also provide query support to applicants, so if you do have any queries in the coming days and months, please do get in touch with us, and our contact details will be placed in the chat function. Before I introduce the webinar, I want to mention that we have closed captioning available, and you can alter the size of those captions by clicking on the CC button, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to our website within the next couple of days, and a link to the recording will also be sent to everyone who registered. Our webinar today is focused on the 2023 MSCA Postdoctoral Fellowship Programme, which is due to officially launch in a couple of weeks on April 12th. The programme funds postdoctoral researchers from all over the world doing excellent research projects with a strong focus on training, skills and career development. There will be a Q&A session after our presentation today, so I invite you to please post any questions that you have into the Q&A function, and we will address as many of those as we can. And many thanks to those of you who have already posed questions at registration. So that brings us to our guest speakers for today. We are delighted to be joined by our panel, which includes Dr. Christopher Reynolds from the European Research Executive Agency, who will present an overview of the 2023 Postdoctoral Fellowship Call, including eligibility requirements. Next, we will have Professor Orla Muldoon from the University of Limerick, who will share her experiences of MSCA from a supervisor's perspective. And then showcasing a successful postdoctoral fellowship awardee, we have Dr. Emma Smith from Maynooth University, who will tell us about her experience of the MSCA application process. We'll begin with our first speaker, Dr. Christopher Reynolds. Christopher, I'll invite you now to share your screen, and I'll ask our panel members to turn off their cameras. Dr. Christopher Reynolds has worked for EU institutions since 2007, latterly as Head of Sector for Project Management in the unit in the European Research Executive Agency, which specifically manages the MSCA Postdoctoral Fellowship Programme. I'm delighted, Christopher, that you're able to join us today, and over to you.
Well, good morning, Jane. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. Hopefully you can see the slides clearly as well. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you this morning. And I'm going to be talking to you, as Jane said, about the Postdoctoral Fellowships Programme of the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions, which is a European Commission funded programme. So hopefully my slides will progress. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to start just by talking you through very briefly what the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions are, and then give you some more specific details about the Postdoctoral Fellowships Programme. I want to look at the main objectives, and as Jane said, talk you through the eligibility criteria that will apply to the call that will open in April, the 2023 call. I will talk through what is required of applicants, and I will briefly go through the evaluation criteria there as well. And I've also included some data on Irish applications in recent years that might be interesting for you. And then we'll be happy to respond to your questions in the Q&A at the end. So what are the MSCA? Well, this is the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions. It's a bit of a mouthful sometimes, so you'll often hear them referred to as the MSCA. This is an EU-level research and mobility programme that's been around since the mid-1990s. It's rather prestigious. It's very competitive. The success rates have generally been falling over the years. They attract a large number of applications. The funding generally is quite competitive as well compared to other fellowships. And we provide funding, different types of funding for all different career stages for researchers, and that's also part of the attraction. There have been so far more than 120,000 researchers supported, so you will be in good company if you apply. So this is just a very brief overview of what the actions look like under the current framework program, which is called Horizon Europe. As I mentioned, really there is funding available for every different career stage there. For doctoral level researchers in the doctoral networks, co-fund, there is funding available for both doctoral and postdoctoral research programs, but today we're focusing on the postdoctoral fellowships. As you can see there, a very large budget available over the 6-year period of Horizon Europe, just over 6.6 billion euros in total. So the postdoctoral fellowships program for this year, we have a budget of about 260 million euros. That means that we can fund something in the region of 1,200 to 1,300 individual fellowships. The call will close in September. As we were saying, it will open in April. So you do have a good sort of 5-month window there to prepare your proposals. The objective, at least this is how it's articulated in the work program, is about enhancing the creative and innovative potential of researchers that already hold a PhD, who are looking to acquire new skills through advanced training, international, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral mobility. So the mobility element there is really a fundamental part of the program. International mobility, of course, but also between disciplines and between different sectors of the economy. In terms of what they look like in practice, these are mono-beneficiary projects. So it's one researcher who is hosted at a single host organization. That host organization must be located in an EU or Horizon Europe associated country. So in addition to EU member states, there are a certain number of countries that are associated to the Horizon Europe program. They participate on a completely equal basis as EU member states. The program is open to all research domains, and that's also a very fundamental point. Please don't think that it's just life sciences or that it's just social sciences. We offer funding to all different fields of scientific research, really from A to Z. And it's also open to excellent researchers of any nationality. So it's open to people coming to Europe, people moving within Europe, and also in the case of the global fellowships that I will explain, people to leave Europe and to subsequently come back. There are some small restrictions for people participating in the global fellowships and for those funded under Euratom, but I can come back to that in a moment. So we have these two different types. On the one hand, and actually the vast majority of the fellowships that we fund are European fellowships, and these are for researchers who are already within the European research area, if you like, within European member states or associated countries, or third countries to come to Europe or to move within Europe. They have a duration of a minimum 12 months and a maximum of 24 months. And more than 3/4 of the fellowships that we fund take this form, essentially. Then we have global fellowships, and there is a ring-fenced amount of budget that is available for these global fellowships. These are fellowships which involve an outgoing phase. So you would go to a third country. For example, you leave Europe to go to the US, to Japan, a country that's not an EU member state or an associated country. You spend 12 to 24 months at a host institution in that country, and then you come back for a return phase of 12 months back to the host country within the EU or the associated country. These have a generally longer duration, from between 24 and 36 months. And in both cases, it is possible to add on what we call a non-academic placement at the end of the project. So you can request in your proposal and integrate into your proposal a period at the end of the normal duration of the project, up to 6 months, that you would spend in a non-academic institution to enhance the sort of intersectorality of your project. As I mentioned, it's a very popular program, and you can see there the evolution over time of the number of proposals that we've received and also the success rates. The success rate is the grey line cutting through the middle there. So it peaked, as you can see here, in 2009, where the success rate was as high as 32%. More recently, it's been generally around the 15% figure. And in terms of the number of proposals, the peak was there in 2020 when we received over 11,000 proposals. Latterly, last year, we received around 7,000. So the success rate, as you can see, is slightly higher, almost 18% overall. So the key points, I will just briefly go through these, and some of them then I will mention in some more detail. But firstly, you have to have a PhD in order to participate in this program. So it really is for postdoctoral researchers only, and that is an eligibility criterion for you to participate. You should have a maximum of 8 years full-time equivalent postdoctoral research experience by the call deadline. So that's counted from the PhD award date, but there are some exceptions as well that I will go on to explain. It is, as I said, also fundamentally a international mobility scheme. So you do have to move to another country in order to be eligible to receive the funding. And essentially, it is a training and career development program through research. So you propose a concrete research project that you will do, and you integrate training and career development aspects into that project in order to further your research career. Non-academic placements are possible at the end of the project for a period of up to 6 months, as I mentioned, and we do actively encourage the undertaking of secondments during the implementation of the project. Those can take place worldwide, slightly different to in the past. They can take place at any institution in the world, up to for a period of up to 1/3 of the project duration. So in a regular, let's say 24-month project, up to 8 months of that can be spent on secondment. And then the durations there, as I've already mentioned, up to 24 months for a European fellowship, 36 months for a global fellowship, and then the non-academic placement added on if that is requested. So just to look at the eligibility criteria in a little bit more detail. So as I said, this is a program for postdoctoral researchers, and as of course the name of the program implies, that means that you must be in possession of a doctoral degree before the call deadline. If your doctoral degree has not been awarded, but you have defended your PhD before the call deadline, then that defense must be unconditional. If there were any changes that were necessary, those must have been completed and accepted before the call deadline, and you would need to be able to prove that if necessary. The research experience. So there is a maximum of 8 years full-time research, postdoctoral research experience counted from the date of award of your PhD. However, time spent outside of research does not count towards that. So if you've been on parental leave, or if you've been doing a non-research related job during that period, then it is possible to extend that because it's counted as full-time equivalent research experience. And then the mobility requirement. So you must not have resided or carried out your main activity in the country of the beneficiary for a European fellowship, or in the host for the outgoing phase in the case of global fellowships, for more than 12 months in the 36 months immediately before the call deadline. So it's important to note this is not a nationality requirement. You can undertake a fellowship in the country of your nationality as long as you have not been resident in that country for more than 12 months in the 36-month period immediately before the call deadline. For global fellowships, there is an additional requirement that you must be a long-term resident of an EU or associated country. That is defined as 5 consecutive years of legal and continuous residence within that country at some point in the past. So as I said, we do encourage secondments as part of the project. These are possible anywhere in the world up to 1/3 of the project duration. Intersectorality is something that is particularly encouraged, and when you look at the evaluation criteria, then you will see that that's something that we particularly encourage, and which can be very useful in terms of career development, knowing that many people doing PhDs and postdocs ultimately will not end up staying in a university environment. So exposure to activities in the non-academic sector is particularly encouraged as part of the program. That's also seen in the non-academic placement. As I said, this is something that should be an integral part of your proposal. You can't add it on later, you have to request it up front when you submit your proposal. But this can be up to 6 months. It must take place at the end of the normal project, and it has to be in a non-academic institution. If it's not, if we were subsequently to see that, for example, it was a university or something like that, then that would be discarded during the evaluation. This has not proven to be enormously popular so far, I must say. Only about 6% of proposals that we've received in the past 2 years have been requesting a non-academic placement. We hope that number will increase in the future, of course. Just to give you an example here of eligibility and how it works. So for a European fellowship, let's take the example of a researcher with Irish nationality who was awarded a PhD in 2019 in the UK. They remain resident in the UK, and they apply for a European fellowship together with a host institution in Ireland. So if we look at the eligibility here, they were awarded a PhD before the call deadline. They have less than 8 years since the award of the PhD, and since they're resident in the UK, and they have been for more than 12 months in the, they've not resided in Ireland for more than 12 months in the previous years. On this basis, that researcher is eligible to apply with a host institution in Ireland, even though they have Irish nationality. As I said, it's a physical mobility requirement. It's not about the researcher's nationality. In the second example, a global fellowship. So let's take the example of an Indian researcher who is currently living in Ireland. They've been there for the previous 3 years. They have a PhD awarded in 2022, and they apply for a global fellowship with a host in France and an outgoing phase in the US. So the question here is, do they have a PhD before the call deadline? Yes. Is it less than 8 years since the award of the PhD? Yes. But are they a long-term resident in the EU or associated country? That's the question here that would need to be answered. To be eligible for a global fellowship, then this researcher must have been living for more than 5 years, or at least 5 years consecutively in the EU or associated country, and that would be something that would need to be checked. Just to talk you through then now the evaluation process and some of the key points that might be of interest to you. As I said, it is a very large-scale program, which means that we have a very large-scale evaluation. 2020, for example, we had over 11,000 proposals. Each of those proposals is evaluated by at least 3 independent experts. So we have a very, very large pool of experts that we draw upon to conduct that evaluation. Means that sometimes we have as many as 4 or even more, 4,000 experts that are involved in this evaluation process. It's an entirely bottom-up program. So as I said, all scientific disciplines are eligible for funding. That means we're calling upon experts from across all those different disciplines as well. We ensure that there is a appropriate balance of the scientific experience of different nationalities, of different genders, ages, from different sectors of the economy, so that the expert pool is as broadly representative of the research community as possible. And then we evaluate the proposals in 8 scientific panels. And when you submit your proposal, you will be asked to select the panel to which your proposal most closely fits. So that's chemistry, economics, engineering, environmental sciences, life sciences, maths, physics, and social sciences. And it is a single stage evaluation. So it's a really sort of one-off. You won't be asked to submit in a second round. It's really a one-stop shop. And also we commit to get you a funding decision within 5 months of the call deadline, which I think is reasonably fast. If you are then subsequently successful, there is an additional 3-month window for us to sign the grant agreement with you as well. So as I said, the evaluation process involves at least 3 independent experts. Each of them will prepare an individual evaluation report. They then have what we call consensus discussions in order to draft the final evaluation summary report that you receive at the end of the evaluation. We allocate proposals to experts based on the descriptors and the keywords that you enter when you submit your proposal. So it is really important that you get those right. We do have human beings checking that the allocation is correct. We do recruit people that we call vice chairs, people that are involved in the evaluation to control and make sure that that is done correctly, but really making sure that you choose the correct descriptors and keywords that accurately describe the content of your proposal is extremely important. The proposals are ranked and the funding is allocated based on the scientific panel. That means, for example, if 10% of the proposals go to physics, then about 10% of the funding will go to proposals in physics. There is, however, a separate ranking for the European and the global fellowships. That's because there is a ring-fenced budget for the global fellowships. That results in them having a slightly higher success rate historically as well. All proposals that score 85% or more receive what we call a seal of excellence, and in some EU member states actually the seal of excellence is used as a way to provide funding to proposals. I'm not sure that's the case in Ireland, but certainly in some other member states, showing that seal of excellence is sufficient in some cases for you to receive funding from national authorities within that country. And for the current call, we have a resubmission restriction. So that means that if you submitted the proposal in the previous year with the same researcher and the same host, then if you scored less than 70% in the previous evaluation, then it won't be accepted or evaluated in the subsequent evaluation. That was one of the measures introduced to try to reduce slightly the number of proposals that we were receiving. As you saw in the 2020 call there, for example, really became rather unmanageable, the amount of proposals that we were receiving, and many of those proposals were resubmissions from previous years. And just to say, there is also an evaluation review procedure. So if you are unhappy with the outcome of the evaluation and you believe that there was some kind of error or something that was not correct in a procedure, then you have the right to challenge the outcome of the evaluation if necessary. I won't go into too much detail here on the evaluation criteria. These are outlined in the MSCA work program and the references there at the bottom of the slide. But please do focus on the fact that 50% of your score will be on the excellence part there on the left-hand side. So those really are the most fundamental parts of your proposal. So focusing on the quality and pertinence of the research objectives of your project, on the methodology, the quality of the supervision, training, and the transfer of knowledge, and then the quality and appropriateness of the researcher's professional experience, competencies, and skills. So just to briefly go through the submission process. So this is all done electronically through the Commission's Funding and Tenders Opportunities portal that you will find online. And it's 2 different sections. So there is a structured data part, which we call Part A, which are the application forms. And there is a technical description, the Part B, that you upload as a PDF. So for the Part A, you will need to have an acronym for your project as well as a title. Those are not the same thing, of course. And you will need to select the scientific area and the panel which is the best fit for your proposal, and then select up to 5 descriptors, which, as I said, best characterize the content of the proposal in descending order of relevance. The first 3 of those will be linked to the panel that you've selected. The others are unrestricted. And then there will be a space for free keywords as well, where you can also specify additional keywords to describe the content of the proposal. You will also be required to include an abstract of your proposal, and you will be asked whether it's a resubmission or not Other data that you will need there, obviously your PhD award date. You will be asked to complete a table for an extension to that if your PhD award date was more than 8 years ago. And you will also be required to indicate your countries of residence for the past 5 years. For the host beneficiary, and if it's a global fellowship for the outgoing host, you will be required to indicate the participant information code. So if the institution does not have one of those, you need to make sure that they have registered before the call deadline so that you can enter that in the system. That's vitally important data for you to know when you're preparing your proposal. And you will also be asked to do so for the non-academic placement host if you are requesting one of those. So the part B is actually 2 documents. So part B1, which is the technical description of the project. There is a page limit of 10 pages. It's very important that you don't exceed that because any excess pages will not be visible to the evaluators. So those will be discarded. They will not be taken into account, which obviously could have a detrimental impact on your proposal. Font size should be a maximum of 11 points with standard spacing. Obviously, we're trying to make sure that everybody has the same amount of content in their proposals fundamentally. And you should please follow the template that will be available on the call page once the call is launched in April, and you will structure your proposal around that template. The part B2, there is no formal page limit. This contains the CV of the researcher, which should be a maximum of around 5 pages. And then there is also a presentation of the participating organizations, including associated partners that are hosting, for example, a secondment or a non-academic placement. And for the global fellowships, you should also include a letter of commitment from the institution that is going to host you during the outgoing phase. Again, a template will be made available for this document on the call page once the call is published. These are the funding levels under the current work program. They are gross amounts. So you can see there the living allowance is €5,080 per month. That is augmented by a mobility allowance that everybody receives. The family allowance you would receive if you are eligible, because you have family obligations. These amounts are corrected by a country correction coefficient that is applicable to the country of the host beneficiary. So, a very high cost country like Denmark, for example, will be the amount will be significantly higher than in a lower cost country like Portugal, for example. But those are supposed to reflect the real cost of living in the country where you will be hosted. And then there are institutional unit contributions there, which are made available for the implementation of your project at the host institution. There are also additional amounts that are available if you need to take long-term leave during the implementation of your project, or if you have special needs, and that's a very specific case, but there is additional budget available for people who have very special needs that really they require extra funds or extra equipment in order to implement their project. Just to show you some of the data on Irish participation in recent years. So this is looking back at the previous framework program, Horizon 2020. Actually, for Irish nationals, the success rate generally was slightly above the average success rate for the calls, with the exception of the IF 2020 call, where it was perfectly in line with the average success rate. For Irish host institutions, again, it was generally slightly above the average, again, with the exception of the 2020 call when it was very slightly below. And this is where Irish researchers are applying to go. So this is the submission data from the 2021 and the 2022 calls. Just to reiterate, as I said, it's not a nationality requirement. So you can see that a large number of Irish researchers are actually applying to the postdoctoral fellowships call in order to come back to Ireland, as you can see. Strong bias, I think, for Western Europe, clearly, in terms of the countries that Irish researchers are applying together with. Just very briefly to go through some of the common errors. Some of these will be self-explanatory, but even so, don't leave it to the last minute to prepare and to submit your proposal. Every year we have dozens of people that miss the call deadline because their computer freezes or their internet connection fails at the wrong moment. You can submit your proposal well in advance of the call deadline, and you can alter it and change it right up to the call deadline. So really don't leave it to the last minute to get everything in the system and everything ready. Every year we have people that don't respect the basic eligibility requirements that I've mentioned because they don't have their PhD before the call deadline. They don't respect the mobility rules, for example. So do make sure you check that before you apply and before you sort of spend your time preparing a proposal that may not be eligible. As I mentioned, page limits are fundamental because any pages that you submit which go above the 10-page limit will not be seen and not visible to the evaluators and will be discarded. So make sure you keep your proposal to that 10-page limit to increase your chances of success. For global fellowships, if there is no letter of commitment from the outgoing host institution, then your proposal will not be accepted. It will not be eligible. So make sure that is there. And then some kind of elements that can cause problems. There can be confusion sometimes between what constitutes a secondment and what constitutes a non-academic placement. As I said, those placements are at the very end of the project. They are for a period of up to 6 months. They must always be in the non-academic sector, whereas secondments can be for a period of up to 1/3 of the project duration. They can take place anywhere in the world. And they can take place in both academic and non-academic institutions as well. And in those cases, that the institution hosting the secondment will also be providing the supervision of the researcher during that period. The non-academic placements, those must be in institutions located in the EU or in an associated country. So they cannot be to institutions in the US, for example, or Japan, whereas secondments can take place worldwide. And one other issue there is that sometimes people are tempted to use a font that is too small in order to cram more data into the proposal. That's something that our system can spot, and you would be asked to resubmit with the correct font size. Again, that can result in you losing part of your proposal. Just some of the dates there for the current planning for the call. So we open on the 12th of April, and as I said, you can submit your proposal and revise it up until 5 o'clock Brussels time on the 13th of September. The evaluation will take place from October to January next year. If you are successful, you will be notified in early February 2024. And in fact, even if you're not successful, you will be notified in February 2024. But for those that are successful, then we would begin the preparations for signing the grant agreements during that period. And the first projects would be starting as early as April 2024, and the latest possible start date being around September 2025. I'm sure that Jane will make these links available to you, but these are places where you can get resources and guidance. Some of that data at the moment is from the previous call, but once the call is launched, all of the data and all of these links will be available on the call page on the Funding and Tenders Opportunities portal. Okay, and that's it from me. So then I will hand you back to Jane.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. And thank you very much for explaining the eligibility criteria so well. We'll hold all the questions until the panel sessions a little bit later, but I can see there is plenty of activity in our Q&A function and also in the chat. So please bear with us. We do hope to get to most questions that come in, and some very interesting ones have come in. So now to our next speaker, and the first of our case studies, and I have the pleasure of introducing you to Professor Orla Muldoon. Orla, I invite you to share your screen, and I'll introduce you formally as you are doing so. So Orla, hopefully we can, yes, I can see it starting there. That's great. So Professor Orla Muldoon is founding professor of psychology at the University of Limerick. Her expertise is in social psychology. She's the current holder of an ERC Advanced Award detailing the social identity model of traumatic identity change. She has supervised many postdocs over her career and has been successful in securing funding with early career researchers from funders such as the IRC, the HRB, the ESRC, and most recently with MSCA. Thank you, Orla, and over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Good morning, everyone. It's a bit strange doing this online, but anyway, here we go. Give it a go. Jane has asked me to talk sort of in terms of top tips for success. So that's basically what I'm going to go through. So the first thing I would say is, if you decide that if you are approached by someone or you're thinking about this, my main piece of advice would be to only offer supervision in your own area of interest. Sometimes you'll be approached by people who might be in a similar field, but not necessarily in your area of expertise. I think you're probably less likely to have success there, but equally, these applications are a lot of work. And they're a lot of work when you're preparing them, and then they're a lot of work for you after they're awarded. So I think it's really important that you have some sort of intrinsic motivation to stay with the project through its course for the 2 or 3 years. And of course, as many of us realize in universities, it is, as the picture depicts here, it's that good work is its own reward. This, for most of us, this just represents additional work rather than a change in our work or a reduction. So I think you really have to be invested in the project for it to work. Okay, so in terms of getting a winning application, I think that there is 2 things. You have to have a candidate that's both willing and able. So as much work as it is to get the application going, it's even more for the candidate, right? Because the candidate is going to write the bulk of the application. So I think at an early stage, you have to figure out that whether or not the candidate is both willing and able. Sometimes people are well able, but they're not particularly willing to invest the amount, because you're investing a lot in an application on a chance of success. So you have to have somebody who's willing to invest on the chance of success and who has the capacity to do that as well. So there's actually 2 things that you need to be checking for. In some regards, the ability part is maybe easier to check, because you can have a sense of whether or not the person has successfully defended their PhD, maybe secured a couple of publications, is showing early signs of expertise, and all of those things that we expect in strong early career researchers. But they also have to have the enthusiasm. So I would really say that it's important to have both. Probably the most difficult one is the person who is willing, but you don't really think they're ready yet. So I think because of this rule about scores of less than 70%, you are being kinder to the candidate if you advise them to wait. I think because it can be hard on candidates to get a very low score back, and they're not likely to come back and apply again. Whereas if they get a good score, they are probably going to go back in if they have enthusiasm for the project. And I guess the other thing I would say is that it's really important that you have a clear shared interest, that you can see a point of intersection in the project that the candidate is proposing and your own interests. And then the second thing I would say is that you can articulate clearly for the funder and for the reviewers what the relative contributions are going to be of the applicant, but also what they're going to bring to your group or your department, and what you're going to give to the candidate. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, because I think if you can articulate that really clearly, it's really helpful for those who get the application to review. So my top tips, if at all possible, get your hands on a successful application in a closely related area. And I think that that's really important, because it allows you to see how people are how people who are successful present their CV and track record, as well as their host organization, and how they weave that into the project. And I think most people are probably happy to share applications so long as you give an undertaking that you don't subsequently share it with someone else. So I would strongly encourage people to do that, just so that you have an idea of what success in the competition looks like. I always start with asking the candidate to write their lay abstract or outline, and then have a conversation with the candidate about that idea. So I kind of use that almost as a basis for a brainstorming meeting or a supervision meeting if it was a PhD student, you know, that you can discuss where it is the project might go, how it might intersect. You have to be clear that there is something that the candidate gains from coming to you. So maybe there's a particular method or a particular theory that they don't have knowledge of that they would get when they come to you, or maybe they would bring something that you don't already have. So they might have a method that you don't already have in your group that they would then bring. So in that meeting, you're kind of trying to iron out whether or not the proposal is viable. Just because of how I work myself, and because I have different commitments, as I'm sure all of you do, I then ask the candidate to send each section of the form, and by that I mean the scientific part of the form, and I review each section in turn as it arrives. And I do it that way because it means that I've only a small section to review. I can turn it around quickly and I can send it back. You can catch things early. It also means that you don't get a full form and the candidate who's written the whole thing maybe a couple of weeks before the deadline, and it's not at all what you thought it was going to be, and you can't see how it connects to your own work. Whereas I think if you keep it that you're over and back, and you know, it's only a section each time, so it's actually quite easy to get it back. You can stay on track that you're both operating to this same shared vision. Generally speaking, the form is, you know, it's hard to fit everything in the form. It's hard to get everything into the form. So sometimes we would use the CV or the environment sections to highlight the value of the match, rather than the scientific. We might just signpost it in the scientific part. But in the CV, you might say what the particular skill is that this person has, and then you'd pick it up in the environment to say that we don't have that skill, and it's really great to be getting it coming into our group. Or we might say that we have a particular skill and the person is going to learn that. And in the science component of their project, you'll highlight to where this new skill would be learned and used. So that weaving is quite tricky to do, but actually it's really useful on a short form because it means that you can push things around a bit and still make sure that you have everything covered. I suppose that would be my key point, that make clear what you, the applicant, and indeed if it's global fellowship, the 2 applicants that we've had funded recently are global fellowships. So make clear what it is the applicant gets by going there and what it is they're bringing back to Ireland when they have done their stint abroad. I think that's really the most important thing, because these are important career stage funding applications. So it really needs to be clear that the applicant is going to get career development, and also that when they come back that they're going to be embedded back into the group that's within the European Union. And this next point, I think, relates, and I kind of feel like a couple of times I've made mistakes on this over the years, that I have listened to, say, advice maybe coming from research support, where and maybe I didn't think that there was space in a particular application for maybe a secondment, or even the other way around. I thought there was space for a secondment, but I didn't push it. I think if you really have a sense that something would be improved by your advice, I think it is important to trust your own judgment, and to advise the applicant based on that. And of course, the applicant is coming to you as a mentor, so they will listen to you. They'll be getting lots of generic advice, but I think the mentor will be able to offer subject-specific advice. So don't be sort of guided too heavily by the generic advice that's out there. Trust in your own judgment on things. And then I suppose I would just reiterate that really, as the mentor and as a scientific expert in the application, you do really need to be responsive to the applicant. I would say, so normally what I would do is I would be aware of, that somebody's deadline was on a particular date, and I would have in my calendar that I'm expecting X, Y, and Z on particular days. Particularly as you near the deadline, there's a lot of work on reading, double checking, proofing, ensuring that things are weaved together, the flow and all of the application. So I do think you need to roll your sleeves up if you want this application to be successful, and you need to be responsive to the concerns the applicants raise, but equally they need to be listening and responsive to the concerns that you raise. And of course, that will make for a really nice relationship, the other side. So I think if you haven't got it at the proposal stage, not only is it unlikely that the project will be properly presented, but actually probably a good sign that things won't go well if you can't be responsive to each other at the outset. I hope that was helpful. They're my best tips, and I wish all of you lots of luck with your applications.
Thank you, Orla. That was terrific, and so interesting to hear I suppose that relationship between the supervisor and the applicant that has to develop in order to make a successful proposal. And I know what you mean about being a strange experience about doing a webinar online. But I think we're getting a sense in the chat and the Q&A that there are people here listening, so which is great. And don't forget, we'll hold off to the questions to the Q&A session. Thank you, Orla. So now we're going on to our case study of a successful awardee, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Emma Smith. Emma, I invite you now to share your screen. Dr. Emma Smith is an MSCA Fellow in the Assisting Living and Learning Institute at Maynooth University, working in partnership with the European Disability Forum to develop a framework for inclusive and resilient assistive technology policies in Europe. Emma has a PhD in Rehabilitation Sciences from the University of British Columbia, with an academic background in international development and a clinical background in occupational therapy. She is also the Secretary of the Irish branch of the Marie Curie Alumni Association and Editor-in-Chief of the Assistive Technology Journal. Thank you, Emma, and over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here to talk to you today about my experience as an applicant for the MSCA program. So just to give you a little background, because I think it helps to see that not everybody's coming with the same experience into this. I started my undergraduate education at Dalhousie University on the east coast of Canada, and that was in international development. I also did my occupational therapy degree there, and then went on to work clinically for a number of years before I did my PhD. So I wasn't one of the applicants who may have gone straight through all the academic stages sort of subsequently. I then went on to do my PhD at the University of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, and then came to Ireland to go to Maynooth University as a postdoctoral researcher. And I started my Marie Curie journey back in 2018 with my first MSCA application. And so this would have been submitted in the autumn of 2018. And this was a year prior to, almost a year prior to completing my PhD or to being awarded my PhD. So I know some people were asking if you could apply before you have finished. And again, it was because I was going to have my PhD by the call deadline. When I did that application, I only scored 80. The cut score was much higher, so I was not successful in that application. I then went on to finish my PhD and started my postdoctoral work. And I started my postdoctoral work in a program that was funded elsewhere and not an MSCA postdoc. I then submitted my second MSCA application in 2020 and had a score of 98.8. So for anybody who maybe has submitted before, or if you're not successful this round, certainly do try again. So the things that maybe made the difference the second time around, my CV had certainly changed in the intervening years, so I had a better CV going into it. I had a much more detailed project, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the feedback that I've gotten throughout the course of this process. And I think overall I had a better application. So the time spent on that application really does matter. So to give you a sense of what my project is, just so you have a sense of what the shape of a project might look like, I have 3 key research work packages. The first is a scoping review, which is largely desk research. The second is a Delphi survey, and this was a methodology that I did not have before, that I had not used before, that I was going to be learning from my host environment, as well as getting experience in participatory research and consensus building. My third work package is around piloting and refining that framework. So I have not developed a framework before, again, something that I'm learning from my host institution, and conducting policy review and focus groups. And then I've included next steps here because we will hopefully move on with next steps from this project, although those aren't part of the funded MSCA project. In addition, and this is something you'll need to detail in all of your applications, there is a significant training component. So I detailed the courses and workshops that I would undertake, and some of those were offered by the university, but others were through a secondment to the European Disability Forum, who I am actually working in partnership with throughout the entirety of my project, as well as others who have been providing some of that training. So courses outside of my university and delivered by other organizations. I've also included training from self-directed learning, as well as communities of practice. And then you'll also need to have a section detailing how you're going to disseminate your work. And this will form hopefully one of your work packages. So we talked about multiple forms of dissemination, in particular having a website, social media, academic publications, as you might expect, but also policy briefs, non-academic publications and reports, as well as visuals and presentations to key stakeholder groups. I also want to talk a little bit about the skills development piece of it. So there are lots of skills that I am developing or contributing to during the course of this. And as you can see, some of them are research skills, some of them are considered transferable skills, and some kind of meet in the middle where they are both research skills, but also more transferable skills. And it's important that you're able to both detail the skills you're going to learn, but also how you're going to learn them. So the ones that I have highlighted in yellow, these are ones where I was looking for very specific, direct training. So where I was looking for specific courses or specific training that I was going to achieve. And then the ones that are highlighted in green are the ones that I was going to achieve through training through research, so training through research. So you can see that some of them end up highlighted twice because I was developing them in multiple ways. And I think that was probably a strength of my second proposal that I did not have in my first. So some of the benefits of the award from my perspective, I think the biggest benefit is that it is dedicated time for you to gain skills and also to conduct research. But I put the skill building first because really it is that dedicated time that you might not get with another award, and something I really appreciate about the MSCA. I think it might be the first time for many people in our careers where we actually are directing our own research in lots of ways, certainly influenced by a supervisor, but perhaps more aligned with our specific interests. You also have funding for things like training, conferences, and other resources that you might need, which is a great benefit. There is a network of MSCA award holders and alumni, which is called the Marie Curie Alumni Association. And don't be fooled by the word alumni. If you are a current award holder, you are also part of the organization. And then, of course, there's the great benefit that if you have an MSCA award, you have increased competitiveness for future grant competitions or jobs. So to get on to the application process, and I would second, I mean, everything that Orla said was really important, but definitely start early, revise often, and submit early. I know Chris mentioned that you can submit right up until the deadline, but you can submit early, that early process, and you can just replace it if you have a new version of it. So definitely get it in just in case, as early as you can. Anything could happen. Make sure you choose the right supervisor and institution. So there should be a good fit not only on your research topic, but also on the methodology that you need to learn in order to conduct your research, as well as the resources you need, and just the fit in general with your supervisor, I think is really important. Certainly seek feedback from your supervisors, peers, especially if you have the capacity to talk to any MSCA fellows that are in your network, as well as your university grants office. I had an extraordinary support from my university grants office, and I was really fortunate to have them. So definitely find out those sources of support. Project feasibility is really important. So you need to be able to choose a project that is both big enough to be worthy of being funded, but also small enough to be feasible. It's this Goldilocks approach of finding something that is feasible for you, that appears feasible to the reviewers, but also meets the criteria for excellence. So finding that balance, hopefully your supervisor or potentially your university grants office will be able to help you reach that. Be very specific about your objectives and your plans for the fellowship. I'll share some feedback in a bit that shows that the lack of specificity is what could harm you. Be truthful, but not shy about your accomplishments. I think a lot of people don't want to appear egotistical, or they don't want to say too much about the things that they have accomplished. And while it's important to be truthful, I think it's also really important that you actually celebrate the things that you've done well. It's important to be very clear, very thorough, and very detailed, and you don't have a lot of space, but you need to make use of all of it. So every single word you use matters. Don't use a lot of extra fluff that's not necessary. And if you can avoid it, never say anything twice. So Orla mentioned using other sections to highlight specific rather than keeping it in the research or excellence section. And I would say that as well. Find spaces for you to put the things that are important and try to avoid saying things twice. Tables can really help you maximize space, but make sure that your tables match your text. That it can happen where you say you're going to do one thing in your text and then your tables don't match, and your reviewers will notice. Make sure your plan is cohesive and tells a very clear story, and that it makes sense together. So it has to have a cohesive vision and cohesive flow, and really needs to address the objectives that you've set. Strongly consider a secondment, but short visits are also an option. And for those, make sure you're choosing the right host, and ideally build a relationship with them in the process so that they can contribute to your application. And absolutely familiarize yourself with all of the Part A and Part B 1 and 2 requirements early. It's easy sometimes to neglect, particularly the Part A and the Part B2, because you're so focused on getting the B1 section done. But I would say you will find yourself stuck if you do not familiarize yourself with all sections of it early. So make sure that that's on your list of things to do. Just also for your consideration, just remember that anything you write, that is the only thing the reviewers know about you and your research. They're not getting any extra information. They're certainly not going to look you up online and see if they can find more out about you. So what you write is what they have. So make sure that if you want them to know it about you, that it's in your application. Most reviewers are going to be comfortable in your subject, but not necessarily subject-specific experts. So don't make any assumptions that they will know a piece of information that is important for the understanding of the content that you're writing. It's your role to convince them that the research is necessary, that it's important, that your methods make sense and are feasible to address your research objectives, that you are the right person to do it with the host institution that you're working with, and that you will have the necessary supports, or that you'll be able to obtain training. You have to very clearly demonstrate that the fellowship will provide opportunities for learning and also enhance your future career prospects. And you have to also very clearly demonstrate that not only will you be receiving training, that you'll actually be able to contribute to the academic and broader community in the work that you're doing. So I'm not going to go through each of these individually because we are going to share these slides, but what I have done is I have taken my own applications and the feedback I've received, as well as applications that I have supported others with their permission, because I've supported a few of my colleagues through applications, and I've taken some of the feedback from all of our collected applications to share with you, because I think it gives you a good sense of what you might hear back from reviewers and the pieces that maybe you really want to pay attention to. So I've highlighted some words here just so I have a focus. And the things I really want to say from a weaknesses perspective is that it's typically a challenge with clarity. So it's that you haven't sufficiently explained something, that you've been too generic, that you don't have a broad enough spectrum of skills, that you haven't justified something well enough. So make sure that your clarity is your primary focus, I would say, on getting your project written. You also should make sure that you have a breadth of training opportunities being provided to you, as well as a breadth of things that you're going to contribute. And not everything should depend on just your supervisor or just your host institution. You should be able to get those skills from a multitude of places and demonstrate that there's variety in what you're getting. I've also given you some strengths, and I have 2 pages here of strengths, but this should give you a sense of what reviewers are looking for in terms of a strong project. So things that are well explained, that are well argued, well justified, things that are credible and specific. Your methodology should be of high quality. It should be appropriate to the questions that you're trying to answer. It should involve any of the key stakeholders which need to be involved in your work. Thinking about your methods of knowledge transfer is really important, and the qualification of your supervisor, but also their experience in the key subject area. Your application also needs to really adequately demonstrate that this project is going to get you to the next stage of professional development or professional maturity. So you'll see in these strengths what that means. It has to be convincing, and it needs to be well outlined. So you should be showing multiple avenues to achieve each piece of the application, as well as your communication activities. So don't neglect the dissemination component just because you have the research component described. And again, it needs to be coherent, feasible, and all of those things. Again, don't neglect the things like your tables or your Gantt chart, because they form a key part of your application. And in fact, I think sometimes it's where your reviewers might go to get a really good sense of what's happening, because it's so easy to read in a table. So don't neglect those at all. And also make sure that your host institution is supporting you as best as they are, as best as possible. As a final thought, just a reminder for those of you who may not be successful that your score is a reflection of what you wrote and how well you convinced the reviewers, and not necessarily a reflection of who you are, how successful you'll be. You may not be successful the first time around, and I mean, the success rate is quite low, so that would not be unusual that you wouldn't be successful, but it's not a reflection on what you have the potential to do. So absolutely apply again, take that opportunity to take a second chance or a third chance even, and just make sure that you're doing the best you can to convince the reviewers that you're the right person for the job. Thank you very much, and good luck, and looking forward to anybody's questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Emma, for a really interesting presentation, and very, I suppose, pertinent about the resilience that we all need to keep going in the face of sometimes funding decisions don't go our way. And Christopher mentioned, I suppose it is a very competitive call, although some good news, I suppose, in the last year with the success rates are thankfully taking an upward turn. I'd like to bring in the rest of our panel now, Christopher and Oliver, to join us in our Q&A session. So, and thanks you to all our participants who've been very active both on the chat and the Q&A. So it's great to have that. I loved, Emma, your mention of the Goldilocks approach. So it has to be just right, not too ambitious, still feasible. And also that advice about the Gantt chart as well. It's so easy to make a change in either in the text or the Gantt chart, and it's not reflected or it's not aligned. The texts aren't and the Gantt chart aren't speaking to each other at the final version. So as expected, some of our questions are related to eligibility. So I might just start with you, Christopher, first. A popular question still is the status of the UK Can it still be a host organization? And also, I suppose, is there preferences, second part of that question, is there preferences between countries? So we have a lot of applicants listening at the webinar. Are they better going with one country over another? So maybe I could ask that question to you, Christopher.
Okay, thanks, Jane. On the slightly tricky UK question, as you're probably aware, currently the UK is not associated to Horizon Europe. It's considered to be a sort of applicant or candidate country, let's say, but that hasn't been formalized. So for all of the Horizon Europe calls up until today, the UK is not considered as an associated country and is not therefore eligible in our case to host researchers. So that may change, as you know, if you obviously following the news. There is discussion at the moment that may change, but you know, I wouldn't assume anything for the time being, and certainly for the current calls, we've not been able to sign any grant agreements yet with UK beneficiaries. Having said that, for secondments, for example, as I mentioned, those can take place anywhere in the world. So secondments can take place with institutions in the UK, for example, as part of your proposal. That's entirely possible. And of course, there's no restrictions on nationality, as we said as well, with the exception of the long-term residency requirement. So UK nationals are able to apply with host institutions within EU member states or associated countries as, you know, nationals of any other country as well. The second part of your question there was about whether there's any preference for particular countries. I mean, really do go back and look at the evaluation criteria. It's not the, you know, the excellence of the university per se, or the country per se. It's about the goodness of fit, really, between the researcher and the host department and of that particular institution. So it's not that simply because if you look at the, you know, the university rankings that the top universities are the most successful. The proposal really should be about the particular research or the particular project, the particular supervisor, the particular work that's being done, and the goodness of fit of all of those things together. Does that respond to the question, I hope? Yeah. That's
great. Thanks, Christopher. Can I ask a related question? If a person was a long-term resident in the UK, does that count as a member of the EU member state? This person, I think, is thinking for the Global Fellowship.
Okay, well, we actually clarified that this week with our colleagues at the Commission. Yes, for the period that the UK was an EU member state. So since the UK left the EU, that period, if you were resident during that period, that would not count. But up until the point where the UK left, then any period of residence during that period would count towards the 5 years. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm reminded that last year at our webinar, we had a similar question about applying with different universities increase your success rate, and I think you answered that question as well today, Christopher. I might turn to Orla if I can, and because we've been discussing really that relationship between the supervisor and the applicant, the researcher, can I ask you how you found your applicants, or how did the applicants find you?
Yes, well, the current two that were just awarded recently are both global fellowships. So they're both people who were Irish who are going out, and then they're coming back. Obviously, I didn't supervise them, or, you know, so they're so it's probably slightly easier to find those people. In the past, when people have approached me, or indeed, if there has been some, you know, if there's collaborators elsewhere, if they've mentioned students that they have or people that they have that are strong, I have always mentioned the Marie Curie as a possibility. So sometimes you get it, you know, the incoming people through networks, but the global fellowships are actually all people who I kind of knew a little bit, or, you know, maybe. had been in the department and had gone somewhere else, or that kind of thing.
Great. I think that's really useful to know, because I know there's a lot of potential supervisors here listening as well. And Emma, I might ask you maybe to elaborate on how you found your host organisation and your supervisor.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I actually applied the first time before I was in Ireland. I was still in Canada at the time, and I found my supervisor through a network connection, like Orla mentioned. My supervisor for my PhD introduced me to someone at the university who introduced me on to my current supervisor because there was a good fit, and we started working towards a Marie Curie application in order to support me coming to Ireland to do my postdoctoral work. And when I wasn't successful, we found alternative funding for me to still be able to come and start some postdoctoral work with them for that first sort of a year before the next application. And so the second application, we had a pre-existing relationship, obviously, but for the first one, it was through networks.
Okay, great. It's good to know how people find the match. And I know my colleague Yvonne has put on the chat some platforms that can be used maybe to find a suitable match. Christopher, can I ask you about the maybe to explain from the RIA's point of view what's needed in a supervisor, the qualities that are perhaps needed in a supervisor? We can see in the evaluation slide that the quality of supervision is a criteria.
It's a very difficult question to answer, of course, because it's a very subjective element, and it will, I think, as with many of these things, it differs between the career stage of the researcher that's applying. Obviously, somebody that's an early postdoc might require slightly more supervision, let's say, than somebody who's more experienced. Certainly, the more experience that the supervisor has in successfully supervising postdoctoral researchers, and particularly within the field, I think that would be obviously very beneficial. And the most successful proposals have, people would generally have reasonably developed experience in supervision. But it's, to be honest, very difficult, to give a kind of objective answer to that question. And I wouldn't want to go too far. I mean, obviously they need to be able to demonstrate successful experience as a supervisor, but beyond that, it would be difficult for me to say, I think. Yeah,
no, I appreciate that. It is a difficult one. And one I suppose we have seen come up in evaluation reports that the supervisor was absolutely excellent, but perhaps not excellent in the specific field that the researcher was applying in. So it's to underscores that match that is needed between both. Christopher, I might stick with you just for another question that has come up about the non-academic placement. And you mentioned that this is, of course, a very recent addition, a very welcome addition, additional 6-month funding that is available. But that many people aren't taking it up. And this question came in about success rates if you do include a non-academic placement. And I'm wondering, would you have any data or thoughts on I suppose, how it is being evaluated?
Well, yeah, to be honest, I don't have any data to hand beyond what I put in my slides there. So it is about 6% of applicants are requesting a non-academic placement. But as far as I can see, the success rate is also about the same. So actually, it's about 5 to 6% of the successful applications include a non-academic placement. So it doesn't seem to affect your proposal positively or negatively if you include it. Obviously, it's supposed to be an integral part of the project, and it's not just an add-on that you request at the end of the project. It should be an integral part of the research project that you're doing. So there should be added value to this placement, of course, being included in your proposal. And another point that was mentioned, how do we determine what constitutes a non-academic institution that would be eligible for the placement? Actually, it's to do with the way that they're validated by the Commission services. So many research institutions and companies are already validated as participants for the the framework program. So in our database, they should have a PIC, the participant identification code, that says that they are not a research organization and that they are a not-for-profit validation. So the institutions themselves should be aware of that in their validation status. If they're not validated, that's something that obviously would be seen when they apply for the validation. But for example, usually libraries or museums, they count as not being research organizations and they're not for profit, so they would be eligible for a non-academic placement. But obviously, universities or research institutions generally would not count.
Great, thank you for that. And there's a question about a non-academic organization. Could it be in the same country as your host organization? Is that possible?
It is possible. The same with secondments. Secondments can take place anywhere in the world, but equally they can also take place in the country of the host organization as well. There's no sort of restriction on that, but they should be, as I said before, justified and an integral part of the project.
Great, thank you. And we have a question come in from a PhD student, and I think there are a few PhD candidates at the webinar, and they're thinking about applying in the future, so not for this year's call, but in the future. And Orla, I wonder, I'll put this question to you. Would you have any advice in terms of how they can prepare, given your success with funding schemes, how can they best prepare I suppose in developing their CV and track record at this stage while they're doing their PhD?
The first thing I would say is they need to keep a note of all the skills they're developing. I think that PhD students can be so busy that they forget to keep a documentation on all the things that they have developed. I think that the important things are probably things like publications and dissemination and impact in non-academic places. I think they're kind of seen as markers. So it is worth, if they get a publication, thinking of having a blog or some kind of additional lay impact kind of a thing. But I think the most important thing is that they keep a log of the skills that they have and the skills that they still want, because actually that is the core of much of what is asked for around track record and development over the period of the Marie Curie postdoc. So I think I suppose my key thing would be to say, keep an eye on the skills you're developing and the skills you still need.
Brilliant. Thank you, Orla. And Emma, I wonder, would you have a view on that as well for PhD students preparing for the future, I suppose, and it's a good place to be, keeping an eye on the timeline?
Yeah, I would say certainly work on both academic and non-academic outputs for your research, but also take opportunities that you are given from a networking perspective to make the connections that you may need in order to have a good fit with your supervisor. So attending conferences, presenting where possible, and making those connections so that you have a broad network that you can draw from and perhaps go to when you're looking for a fit.
Great, thank you. And there is as Christopher mentioned, there is a CV template available in the proposal templates, and that might be of use to anyone doing their PhD, because it might remind you of some things to put in there and have a look at, and particularly just to note, under your publications list, it does make reference that you don't need journal impact factors, but you should take the opportunity to put in a very brief qualitative assessment of the scientific significance of those publications, and a great opportunity to add your role, particularly if you have multiple authors in those publications. Some few more eligibility criteria. I just want to make sure I have them all. A good question has come in about, is there any way, Christopher, that we can check eligibility before submitting a proposal?
I mean, the fundamental eligibility criteria are those that we've presented this morning. Those will be confirmed once the call is published. I think in the vast majority of cases it will be pretty clear, I think. when you submit your proposal, as we said, for the maximum 8 years period, for example, there's a table there that you can complete in the application. So you will be able to encode the number of days, for example, that you've spent outside of research and things like that would help. If there are, and I throw this a little bit back at you, Jane, actually, but if there are very specific cases, then the national contact points can help, I think, advise on those very specific cases. But I would think that for the vast majority of applicants, the eligibility criteria should be rather clear, and how they are applied, I think, should be reasonably straightforward. But any sort of particularly complicated cases, I know that the NCPs are there to help, and NCPs frequently consult us as well in Brussels if any of the rules are unclear in specific cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So do contact us. I'm aware sometimes people's lives don't fit as neatly as you think into the eligibility criteria. So particularly if you have been traveling to different countries and you just need to tease it out, myself and Yvonne are very willing to engage. So do contact us. We put in our contact details in the chat. I see our chat is very busy advertising postdoc positions as well. So great opportunities there too. But do contact us in the Marie Curie office, and we'll certainly tease out any of the very specific eligibility criteria that people have. A question has come in about whether there is a national repository of successful applications, and I just thought I'd answer that by saying no, it doesn't exist at national level. But we do know some institutions may have one or may have access to proposals that they are willing to share with the applicant's permission. And of course, we've heard from Emma that sometimes a network does build up on which people are able to share. I would say, just in relation to previous proposals, while it can be very useful, the call can change and does year by year, and particularly that difference between H2020 and Horizon Europe. And with that in mind, sorry, Emma, I'll let you come in there. I can see your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I actually find that the feedback is just as valuable as the proposal. So if you do have within your network someone who's able to share their proposal, but also their feedback, sometimes you actually might get more from reading the feedback they received than just the proposal itself.
That's great. Yes, good to know that. And I suppose one of the things about applying is there is quite extensive feedback given in the evaluation summary report. I mentioned there a difference between H2020 and Horizon Europe, and I wonder, Christopher, can you talk a little bit about this emphasis now on open science and also gender and diversity that's present in Horizon Europe, and how that's reflected in the Marie Curie application process?
Okay, yeah, I mean, both of those things that are obviously are now sort of supposed to be taken into account when you draft your proposal, and really not just considered as an afterthought. So open science, for example, it's really about ensuring that you've integrated open science practices into your proposed methodology. So you can show that you're already thinking about how you're going to be sharing any data that you might generate, how you will ensure that your publications and results will be in the public domain, for example. For gender and other diversity factors, again, it's really about taking these into account in your methodology, insofar as they're obviously relevant for your research. But that might not be always obvious at first. But an obvious example during the pandemic, for example, we've all seen that there were differences in hospitalization rates between the way that different genders, for example, reacted to vaccines. There has been different uptake of vaccines based on gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, things like that. So if you ignore these differences, then by definition, your research will be incomplete. So really the emphasis here is making sure that your research methodology and that your research approaches are as complete as possible, essentially, and that those should be integrated when you prepare your proposal and not just added as an afterthought at the end.
Great, thank you for that. And I suppose that underscores Emma's point and Orla's point as well, I suppose, by starting early, engage early, and get to grips with the proposal. We have a question that has come in about how can a person judge if their CV is competitive? And Orla, I might ask you maybe to comment on that. So part of the application form, as we know, is the applicant has to address their professional experience. But how can they judge, or how would you advise them when you see an applicant's CV? Is it competitive enough?
I guess the question is that being asked by somebody who is an applicant or somebody who is a supervisor? If it's been asked by an applicant, I would say that they're not well placed to judge their own CV. They probably should ask someone else. None of us judge our own CVs terribly well. And many people undersell themselves on their CVs. They damn themselves with faint praise, and don't own. And I think that's a very common phenomenon. So I would say that if you're not sure if your own CV is ready, ask someone you trust to give you a frank and honest assessment. Because it's about whether or not it's ready yet or it's ready next year. It's not an indictment of you personally. If it's a supervisor asking the question, I guess I would say that considering the amount of work and the very many things that we all have to do in academic life, you would need to be reasonably convinced that the person that has approached you is someone who is a self-starter, is going to be able to write, large chunks of this, is willing to listen to advice. So I'm not sure that necessarily that, counting publications is going to be the solution. But I do think the conversation where the person has written a lay abstract and there's a conversation, or, you look at the CV and to kind of draw out what skills they have. I suppose I would say I don't think people are getting funded without any publications. I would say that that's probably almost a given. But after that, I think it's much more about professional judgment for the supervisor than it is about counting accomplishments.
Right. Thank you for that. Christopher, can I turn on you for one of the final questions? And it's a little bit about implementation, really, just about how the Global Fellowship works. Sorry, not the Global Fellowship, the non-academic placement. How is the funding? Does the funding go to the beneficiary? Does it go to the non-academic organisation? Is it part of the fellowship?
Okay, so yeah, we provide the funding as part of the fellowship. It's calculated on the same country correction coefficient as the host beneficiary. How that money is divided or distributed between the two institutions is really a matter for them. We don't have any say or any kind of, we don't insist on anything there. That's down to an agreement between them. And that's the same also in a global fellowship, how the funds are distributed and what kind of working arrangement there is between the institutions is really between the institutions. We sort of pay the money and leave them to make the administrative arrangements.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. I can see the time is now 28 minutes past 12. So I just want to alert people to the fact that if you'd like to hear more case studies about successful projects, last year's webinar is also available on our YouTube channel. And a reminder too that the IUA hosts the EuroAccess Ireland office, and EuroAccess Ireland provide very helpful practical support for researchers and hosting organisations, and that includes visa queries as well as links to research and career development opportunities. And if you want to avail of EuroAccess support, you can contact my colleague Magda on magda@iua.ie. We'll put Magda's details into the chat function as well. Just to let you know, also in the Irish Marie Curie Office, we'll also be running a two-part postdoctoral fellowship workshop for applicants in late May, and we'll go through in detail each section. So I realise there might have been some questions in the Q&A related to very specific information in the proposal, and we'll address that in our recorded postdoctoral fellowship workshop in May. Finally, I want to say thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you found it informative and useful, and I'd like to very much thank all our contributors for very generously giving both their time and their insights today and sharing their personal experience. I'd like to bring our session to a close, and I want to wish everyone a very pleasant day and look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Best luck for all of those applying for this year's call. Thank you.